Welcome to Nation to Nation. There's only 1 week left for the federal government to meet its promise to Kinder Morgan to guarantee that the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion will be built no matter what. This week, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh ended his party's neutral stance on the project, saying the Canadian taxpayer should not be covering any losses due to delays. Instead, any subsidy to fossil fuels should be invested in clean energy. Our political panel of MPs once again debates the merits of Trans Mountain. And I'm going to break a little bit with tradition because you're new here, Don, or Mr. Davies, I'm sorry. The NDP has finally come off the fence, I suppose, when it comes to Kinder Morgan. Why have you given up neutrality and kind of chosen BC Premier John Horgan over Alberta Premier Rachel Notley?
Well, first off, please call me Don. I don't know that I would frame the question that way. The New Democrats have expressed concerns about the federal pipeline policy for years now. We, of course, were very strong critics when we were the official opposition about the previous Harper government's environmental assessment model, which we thought was grossly deficient. It didn't allow for full access to the process from a number of stakeholders, including Indigenous groups. It didn't take into account downstream carbon emissions, which is, of course, given the global problem of climate change, I think, a glaring error. So we've always been opposed to the pipeline because it has never really gone through a proper process. I think now at this point we know enough about the impacts of bitumen on our coast and the fact that you can't clean it up.
Oh, that's not true.
Well, it is true, and bitumen sinks, and there's no effective way to really clean up a spill. We know that a quadrupling of tankers through the Burrard Inlet is not acceptable to the people of Vancouver and Burnaby, and I'll end by saying Prime Minister Trudeau said clearly that governments grant permits, but only communities grant the social license. And that social license has clearly not been obtained by the people of British Columbia. And finally, I would just say that there's no way we're going to meet our Paris climate change commitments if we expand fossil fuel infrastructure. And I haven't heard the Conservatives or the Liberals explain to Canadians how we're going to meet those targets and expand the exportation, the tripling of oil through the Port of Vancouver.
Ms. McLeod, you wanted to jump in there?
I think, first of all, to say that people in British Columbia are against it is not accurate. You know, certainly some of the latest polls are indicating there's in the range of 60% that are supporting it. I also want to note many First Nations communities, including in the riding where I represent, are vocal advocates for it. They see it as opportunities. Yesterday, we had the Métis National Council come out in support of this particular initiative. We're talking about a pipeline that is run through the communities I represent for 60 plus years. I see oil car after oil car after oil car on the tracks every day as I'm driving up the North Thompson Valley. And certainly from my perspective, not only are we sort of taking the opportunity away from getting our softwood lumber to market, from our grain products because of the capacity on the trains, but also it's certainly I would rather see the pipelines being used. To say that you can't clean up the bitumen, obviously hasn't read the report from Transport Canada that was recently released, and there's certainly, really important information there, and I recommend he read it. So, I think this is an important project for Canada, and it's really concerning to me to see, what's happening in terms of the relationship between British Columbia and Alberta.
Ms. Jones, it's funny to see you and your Conservative opponent nodding in agreement on this, but how can you meet that deadline, which is actually just a week from today, when there's still a court case out there, First Nations-led court case, that is still seeking to overturn the pipeline?
Well, I don't think people should be surprised that you're going to see tremendous support for this pipeline from both Liberals and Conservatives parties in Canada, because both recognize that this is in the country's best interest. Both recognize that there are tremendous opportunities here for both British Columbia and for Alberta. And I agree with my colleague when she says that there is support for this in British Columbia, and we're well aware of that. What's important to note, I think, around this entire project is that it has probably gone through some of the most critical scrutiny environmentally of any resource development project that we've seen in the country of late. Our government decided to implement additional oversight around environmental evaluation and analysis. We did that. There's been tremendous consultation with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities throughout this process. And it's no secret that many Indigenous governments have signed on to support this initiative and to negotiate over $300 million in benefit agreements for Indigenous communities.
But how can you meet that deadline a week from now when there's a court case that's it's like a shroud over the whole thing?
Well, people have the opportunity and the right to go to the courts or to take whatever measures that are allowed legally and democratically in the country to voice their opinions. However, the fundamental piece to all of this is that the project has been sanctioned. And it has been granted permission and met all of the environmental criteria and have upheld their economic investment commitments to this project. And there is absolutely no reason for government or any government to stand in the way from this proceeding. That's the process that we have implemented in this country to do large-scale development. It does not, of course, people still have the ability, if they want, to bring these cases to court. As for us, for our government, we're continuing to work with the proponent to ensure that this project does move forward and does so around the timelines that are being implemented at this stage, and we're committed to continue to do that.
Mr. Davies, you've heard that this project has been the most scrutinized in the history of projects. How do you respond to that?
Well, I just heard a lot of talking points and that ignore a lot of facts. Justin Trudeau came into British Columbia in the last election in 2015, and he specifically told British Columbians that the Kinder Morgan pipeline did not go through a proper environmental assessment process under the Harper government, and he promised a new one. When he got elected, he broke that promise. There were some more consultations, but nothing that fundamentally altered the very flawed process. Mr. Harper ran the environmental assessment process through the National Energy Board. Nobody in British Columbia accepts that there's been a proper assessment of this project. Number two, when we say that, excuse me, I didn't interrupt you, Kathy. There's Indigenous. When they say that when they say that there's Indigenous support, the Squamish oppose this, the Tsleil-Waututh oppose this, the Coldwater Band opposes this, and these are bands that stand right at the epicenter where this pipeline is going to be discharged into the coastal waters of British Columbia, and whose fisheries, whose economic activity is the most affected. So any of your listeners who think that there's Indigenous support for this pipeline, they're wrong. I also want to say that there's been recent information that has come out.
Tremendous Indigenous support.
Well, I just talked to the Tsleil-Waututh, talk to the Squamish, which I did last week.
We can cherry pick anywhere in the country on any project that we
cherry
want.
Picking. And the final thing I want to say is there's been very, very, I think, disturbing information that has come out that is the basis for the Indigenous claim to court. The Indigenous people are in court right now, so clearly they're not happy with it, where it suggested that the Trudeau cabinet was going through surface bargaining, the surface consultation with the Indigenous people, because they were looking for to get the legal go-ahead at the same time that they were supposed to be engaged in meaningful consultation with Indigenous people. So, let there be no doubt that this pipeline is highly controversial. It does not engage or enjoy broad Indigenous support. It's got serious environmental concerns, and that's where we're at as a country.
Okay, Ms. Jones, I'll give you a chance to rebut that.
Yeah, thank you, because you can spin this any way that you want, and all Don is doing today is spinning, and it's not factual at all. The facts are what is on paper. The facts are what is happening right now in British Columbia and in Alberta, and that is there are Indigenous governments that are very much supportive of this project, and they are very engaged in this project. But you also cannot ignore the fact that even though the project went through an environmental assessment, Prime Minister Trudeau said, we're going to top that. We're going to do more environmental scrutiny on this project. And we did it to the opposition of a lot of people who said, you don't need to be doing this. But we did it anyway. And we appointed oversight panels to look at the environmental impact. And those panels included Indigenous people as well. So to say that, you know, there wasn't proper environmental protocols implemented by the Liberal government, indeed there was. And it went above and beyond any environmental legislation that existed in the country at that time.
I'll have to leave it at that, unfortunately. I wanted this. Thank you all for being here. This is our last panel of the season. Again, I want to thank you for all this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
After the break, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler talks about moving beyond the Indian Act. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Alvin Fiddler is Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. It represents 49 First Nations in Northern Ontario. This week it held a determination summit here in Ottawa. The main question posed to delegates is how to move beyond the Indian Act. To talk more about it, I'm joined by NAN's Grand Chief, Alvin Fiddler. Welcome to Nation, Grand Chief.
Thank you.
Now, I watched a bit of your speech this morning, and you held up your status card, and you talked about it. How does that symbolize to you how you need to move beyond the Indian Act?
I think it just shows us how racist this legislation is. You know, the fact that people like myself are assigned a number when we're born, and that's something I don't want for my two daughters. And we have, my wife Tisa and I, we have two girls. They're 18 and 13, and I just can't stand the thought of them, you know, being identified with a number by the government all their lives. And I think that's something that stood out for me when I was preparing for this conference.
You must have your own personal ideas of what needs to be done to move beyond the Indian Act. What would those be?
Well, I think, you know, if you ask people this question, they'll probably get different answers. I think for me, it's more than just dismantling this piece of legislation. I think it's restructuring the whole governance system, not just from our side, but from the federal government side as well, that in order for this to truly be an act of reconciliation for everyone, that it has to be a collaborative effort, that this new framework needs to affirm and recognize our treaty rights, that it has to be based on the, you know, UNDRIP and others, that other rights or our inherent rights that we have, and that it has to be a respectful process and inclusive of everything that we have.
I've often heard Crown Indigenous Minister Carolyn Bennett and Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott talk about, hey, we want to work our way out of our job, that these departments never exist. Do you take them at their word when they say this kind of things?
Well, I think that's something that we all need to work towards. You know, the fact that First Nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, were governed by programs, and it's something that is not working. In fact, is creating harm, especially to our young people. I talked about that this morning, that we need to move beyond that, and if it means a total restructure of the federal government, dismantling the whole department, that's something that I think that needs to happen.
What are some of these issues, the harmful issues you think that are at the top that really need to be looked at immediately?
Yeah, I talked about the burden, the colonial burden that our children carry, and the impact that it has on their lives. And I talked about the Anishinaabe Nation, the fact that just last year alone we lost 32 of our members to suicide, and many of them were young girls from 10 to 11, 12, 13, 14. And now what we're seeing with the child welfare system, the fact that many of our children are still being taken away through another process, is something that should concern all of us, and that's why we need to really work together and come together to build something new.
Do you think if we got rid of the Indian Act or moved beyond the Indian Act, as you say, some of the issues that happen in the place where right now you have your office, Thunder Bay, would that make things better for the people who live there?
I think it would create a sense of hope that, especially for young people, that something is being done. something is going to replace the Indian Act, and that we will have a say in what that is. I think that's something that we hope will come out from this conference, is that there'll be a sense of ownership of what this is, and that everyone, our communities, our members will have a say in terms of what that will look like and how that will move forward.
Of course, I've heard the talk that if you replace it, or if you get rid of the Indian Act, you have to replace it with something. Some sort of bureaucracy has to replace it to distribute programs and services. How would that be any different than what's happening now?
Well, I think that's why I said that it's more than just scrapping the Indian Act and replacing it. We also need to look at the whole governance structure, how the whole bureaucracy in terms of the department, for example, in terms of how the federal government is structuring itself. And I know they did a bit of a rejig last year with the splitting of the department. I think it's got to go way beyond that, and that's something that we need to look at, and that's something that we are saying now that we need to be a part of.
When you say beyond splitting the department, what do you mean exactly?
Well, it could mean that that total restructuring will mean that that at some point it needs to be dismantled. That's what we're hearing, is that the issues are beyond than just a piece of legislation. It's how it's being administered and how it's being delivered, and that's something that we need to look at as well.
Okay, Grand Chief, I want to thank you for dropping by our studio and talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
When we come back, we hear from Senator Mary Jane McCallum. Stay with us. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Just over 5 months ago, Prime Minister Trudeau named Mary Jane McCallum to the Senate. Senator McCallum is from Manitoba and Cree. She has been a dentist for over 25 years and is in fact the first Indigenous woman to practice dentistry. Senator McCallum has been very active on the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, scrutinizing witnesses on everything from Indigenous health to the potential impacts of the new cannabis law. Joining me now is Senator Mary Jane McCallum. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much.
Now, I mentioned earlier that for months the Senate has been looking at the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada. How do you think those meetings have gone? Do you think they're going to turn out to be something we can use?
I think that what the findings that they get from all the witnesses that have come to testify before the committee, that we're getting a lot of information. It's also a form of consultation. So we're asking people, how do you idealize an ideal framework? And then they talk to us about some of the problems that they have, what they want. So it's a good way to start the discussion. And at the end, if the people decide that they want to go into self-government, then they have different models of what they can use.
How well do you think the government has been doing in improving this relationship? And I'm talking about the House of Commons side.
Say it again.
How well do you think the government has been doing to improve the relationship with Indigenous people? And I'm speaking mainly about the federal government in the House of Commons.
Well, I'm amazed that when I came, I didn't realize that they had this government-to-government relationship talk. And when I went to my first meeting, I was absolutely amazed that it was even on the floor. So for events to move as fast as they did, which I think that's fast, and to have the discussions on the floor, and that it's public, and that it's supported by the House of Commons, it's incredible.
What more do you think needs to be done, though, when it comes to improving the relationship with Indigenous people?
I believe that more consultations are needed with Indigenous people to let them know what's happening at Senate. I believe there needs to be more concrete action and support from the federal government in walking the talk. If they say that this is a new relationship, that they're going to support us, then they need to start actioning it.
Well, let's talk about a specific piece of legislation that the Senate is really looking at right now, which is Bill C-45, the cannabis law. Now, I know you've expressed some concerns about this piece of legislation. I suppose, can you tell me what those are?
With the marijuana bill, I was concerned about it, that there'd be a lack of resources, there'd be a lack of policing. And the more I attended meetings, the more I listened to witnesses and experts, doctors about marijuana, I started to see it as a public health issue, that we need to get out, we need to speak to the children about marijuana, and we need to sit around the tables and discuss a lot of the issues that we have.
Now, of course, there's a real time crunch on this particular piece of legislation. Do you feel the government is ramming this through too quickly, especially through the Senate?
I think so. I believe that First Nations needed, when they met with us, because the Aboriginal Peoples Committee had witnesses about the marijuana bill, a lot of the elders expressed concern about marijuana and the suicide rates in their communities. And it seemed that most of the people wanted it delayed so they could have time to deal with it before it came into their communities. So because of that, I believe that that it was moving too fast. And yesterday we talked to a group of men, and they work in the provinces, and they said that, and we had been told the provinces were in the same state, but he said they're getting ready, they're almost ready. And so for our people, we need to get the message to them somehow. When I worked in the field in 2016, I didn't even hear about the marijuana bill. In 2017, it wasn't out in the communities.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to quickly ask you, after 5 months on the job, do you have any regrets about being named to the Senate?
Absolutely not. It is an amazing place to work. And, you know, people talk about senators as if they don't work. They're one of the hardest working group I know. They're on the committees. Like yesterday, I went from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. And they do a lot of work, they do a lot of research, they speak up for Canadians, and it's just an incredible place to work.
Well, it's nice to see another Indigenous person in the Senate, and I want to thank you for speaking to me today.
Thank you.
Next week, our season finale will look at keeping kids out of care. We'll have the story of one mother who got her son back, but how she did it may surprise you. And Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott will be here to talk about the child welfare crisis. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.